Part 3. So let's see who is in the running to take over Virgin Australia. It seems it's now down to 4. Bain Capital, BGH, Indigo Partners and Cyrus Capital. 2 stand out here, Bain Capital and BGH. These are private equity, and you may have heard about private equity. Private equity buy cheap and sell expensive a few years later. There's nothing wrong with that, but the way they do it is all wrong. The media makes the process look fiercely competitive, but they're not. It's more a case of, you guys can have this takeover, we'll have the next one. 3 private equity companies that take over Australian companies include Bain Capital, TPG and KKR. Malcolm Turnbull now performs work for KKR. Ben Gray, son of a former Tasmanian Premier, works for TPG. He's the head of the Australian division. But now he works for BGH. Usually, 2 out of 3 of these companies are a contender whenever there is a prize takeover opportunity. In this case, the prize is Virgin Australia. Let's take a look at how private equity fit in with each other. In 2011, Bain outbid rival KKR to take over the software company MYOB. They then listed it on the Australian Stock Exchange in 2015, keeping a 25% stake. Even though Bain and KKR are supposed to be fierce rivals, the auction was run by Aidan Allen from UBS. But Aidan didn't just work for UBS, he also worked for Citibank. And when he worked for Citibank, Bain Capital, one of his main clients. And when he worked for UBS, he was advising MYOB. Aidan advised both Bain and MYOB over a time when MYOB was taken over by Bain, listed on the ASX, fell to a new low share price after years of short selling and price manipulation, and then taken over again, this time by KKR, who originally outbid by Bain. And this is only just scratching the surface of the typical connections between the private equity firms and the advisory companies. There is not competition between private equity firms, there is collusion. It is part of the reason more than 6,000 people have signed this petition demanding a royal commission into the dishonest practices on the ASX. Now BGH. BGH is basically another private equity team that TPG renamed. TPG bought Myer off the Coles Myer Group, listed it on the Australian Stock Exchange, selling their entire stake at the share price of $4.10 in 2009. The share price has fallen since day one to where it is today at 27 cents. And now private equity firms are again circling it. Myer made TPG $1.3 billion in the 3 years they owned it before they listed it. And here is how the owners of TPG spent the money. Within hours of the TPG sell-off of Myer, that bounty disappeared. Overnight, $1.5 billion was spirited out of Australian bank accounts to the Netherlands before being transferred to companies based in 2 notorious tax havens, Luxembourg and the Cayman Islands. TPG also bought Ingham's Group in 2013 for $880 million. 3 years later, they listed it on the Australian Stock Exchange for $1.3 billion after already selling many of the real estate assets. TPG have now offloaded most of those shares and now the short sellers have started attacking Ingham's. Actually, all 3 of these companies, MYOB, Ingham's and Myer, have at some stage become the most shorted stock on the ASX, only after the private equity firms sold most of their shares. It is an intriguing coincidence. And what happens after short sellers attack? Takeovers come from private equity. So what do I think when I hear Bain Capital say they're going to be invested in Virgin for the long haul? I think it's nonsense. And I think all this needs to change now. And if a private equity firm takes over Virgin and relists it on the Australian Stock Exchange a few years later for a massive profit, who would be daft enough to buy shares in the newly listed Virgin Australia when every investor knows to stay away from private equity relistings? The investors in Virgin will of course be the super fund managers who manage our trillion-dollar superannuation industry. Why? Because they don't care about what returns we get, but they do care about looking after private equity. And who is supporting Bain Capital's bid for Virgin Australian Super, the largest super fund in Australia? And who else is supporting Bain's bid? Goldman Sachs. And who else is supporting Bain's bid? Mentha, the administrator that was taking $1 million a week in fees when RM was in administration. All of this is found in this article here. Private equity, super funds, short sellers and administrators work together. The super funds lend the shares to the short sellers. Then the short sellers drive down the share price. Then the private equity companies take over the company. Again, it is a cycle that repeats itself over and over again on the ASX. Then the administrators make the administration process overly complicated so that only favoured parties win the prize. Who are the main losers throughout all of this? Every single Australian who has super. It's called a heist for a reason, a private equity heist for a reason. The heist is on your super. Then every single Australian loses out because voluntary administrations set up these things called DOCAs, which usually wipe out the tax office debt. And that's Commonwealth debt, which could have been used for things like hospitals and volunteer fire trucks. And where is Australia's regulator throughout all this? And what happened when the Queensland government stepped in and said they'd rather buy Virgin instead of another private equity heist? They got this tweet from the Minister for Home Affairs. One has to wonder why our Home Affairs Minister is against the only sensible option when an Australian company that was 90% foreign owned falls into voluntary administration and then is at the mercy of being taken over again by private equity and going through another vicious private equity cycle, which is not in the slightest bit of interest for Australia.